Alrighty, hi there. I'm Chris from Airwindows, and though I kinda have something new for you today, maybe not so much because I am busy doing a major update thing going on. See, these are my instructions for all the individual things that I have to do in order to port my audio units over to the new format so I can run them on the M1 processor. These are individual steps, or in some cases, find and replace things both with grep and without that will help me do that, much of which is underway. So today is not so much a posting new plugin day as a status update. And I also have been made aware of some concerns with some of the older plugins. Namely, there's still a download, but it's not really new stuff. It is 6 plugins that turned out to have issues in instantiating and having their buffers or whatever cleared out properly. These were plugins that had glitches. And somebody who was using the Linux version filed a patch for updating the glitches. Unfortunately, they didn't catch all of them correctly, and they filed a patch only for the Linux. And any glitches would have also been present in Mac VST, both the Windows VST versions, so I basically had to do them over from scratch. So what I've got for you is updates that I did from scratch for BuildATPDF, Iron Oxide Classic 2, that one's fairly recent, PodcastDeluxe, ResEQ, Slew, and StarChild. And I know that ResEQ and StarChild had, in particular ResEQ on some of the VST hosts, like makes scary noises and stuff and freaks out. So the idea is that I have updated those. There's a download that you can do which you can get your hands on all 6 at once. So if you'd like to replace them, that's the way to do it. It's also updated in NewUpdates.zip. And it's also updated in every individual download that you can get. So that is a process that I'm going to be going through when I do the M1 builds. And like I said, these changes take you from the original AU to the new one that will run on the M1 processor. I am going to post that, by the way, once I have it sorted out, because some of the final, like the end of the pages, I'm not sure I have all those parameters exactly right, so this is a process. But I can tell you which plugins are included, and I intend to do just that. But people wonder, what are all of these plugins anyhow? And I can say, oh, well, it's in NewUpdates.zip. Thing is that what.txt is most recent first, and there's kind of a lot of entries. So I thought I would go through what is on my plate as far as the ones that I have to do all these things to. Once I have done that, I'll be able to post the new M1 versions, and then if anything is still not right with them, I'll have to go through and do them all over again. So which plugins are we talking about? Acceleration is an acceleration limiter that tames edge and leaves brightness. Acceleration 2 is acceleration, but better, updated for high sample rate and a more extreme effect. AD Clip 7 is the ultimate Airwindows loudness maximizer / peak control. ADT is a double short delay tap with saturation. Air is a different bright EQ from any other. It says it requires 44.1K. I probably have ways of dealing with that. We'll get to that later. API Calypse is a re-release of my old API-style color adder exactly as it was. A quick voice clip softens headset mic recordings that have been super hard clipped on capture. Atmosphere is Console 5 processing with powerful new acoustic distance effects. Aura is a new kind of resonant low-pass EQ. That one really does have a distinctive sound, by the way. Autopan is recent, is for getting some organic stereo movement into your mix. Average is a distinctive sort of low-pass filter. It is literally an averaging filter. Avermatrix turns averaging into a full-featured EQ, in that you get to subtract it and stuff. I've been recommending Avermatrix recently. People were working on Verbity. I better keep going. I'm still on A. Bassamp is an old plugin with new tweaks that give some bass guitar tones. Bass Drive is an old secret weapon. It's like a kind of a bass amp. It's an EQ, but built on density-style adjustments. Bass Kit is centered bass reinforcement with subs fill. It's clean and controllable. Baxandall is a killer general-purpose EQ. Beam is a word-length reducer that tries to heighten sonority. Very experimental, this one. Biquad is the Airwindows implementation of a biquad filter. Been using those all over the place lately. Biquad 2 is the Airwindows biquad filter that's more sweepable and synthy, although there's limitations to that, but still, the intention was that. Biquad Double is a handy Airwindows cascaded biquad filter which will give you steeper roll-off before resonance. Biquad 1/2 is an interleaved biquad filter like biquad, except for interleaved filters is like what I'm doing in density and drive and stuff. It's a whole other thing. Biquad Triple is a handy Airwindows cascaded biquad filter with steeper roll-off before resonance. Note, however, that if you're going to cascade biquad filters, you can also stagger the resonant frequencies in interesting ways, and I do that a lot lately too. Byte is an unusual edge maker. BitGlitter is an old sampler-style digital lo-fi plugin. Word length shift gain. I've already said it. Bit shift gain is the one weird trick perfect boost pad, but in 6 dB increments only. It's also the plugin where if I say the name, Google thinks I've been swearing. Block Party is like a moderately saturated analog limiter. Brass Rider is one weird trick for drum overheads in metal. Specifically what that does is that it will try to bring up or push down just the cymbal crashes, but not respond to other things. Anyways, one weird trick for drum overheads in metal. Bright Ambience is a plugin for very bright gated reverbs. It's a very old one. Bright Ambience 2 is more bright ambience with better tone and more slapbacky effects. BuildATPDF is a dither making toolkit that is in the updates that I've just done. Bus Colors 4 is the Airwindows console emulations. They're now working up to 192K correctly. Buttercomp is my softest and smoothest compressor, and Buttercomp 2 is improved Buttercomp with an output control and sound upgrades, because Buttercomp was a very minimalist plugin. Hey, we're through B. On to C. C5 Raw Console is the original Console 5 algorithm with optional very gentle DC suppression if you want it, or you can leave it off entirely. Some people really liked that Console 5 algorithm, but it caused problems with like sawtooth waveforms. So the release version of Console 5 got heavily changed, and C5 Raw Console is closer to what originally came out that was arguably a problem for people. It was harder to make work properly. Caliber is a re-release of another old character plugin. Capacitor is a low-pass, high-pass filter of a new type. Capacitor 2 is capacitor with extra analog modeling and mojo. These are Airwindows style IIR or interleaved IIR filters, and capacitor 2 is offsetting it in an interesting way based on researches that I ran across on hardware capacitor behavior. It essentially had slightly different behavior depending on whether there was a positive or a negative swing into the capacitor, because the voltage pressure against the capacitor changed the cutoff. Capacitor 2 is that. Channel 4 is a tone coloring plugin that gives more of an analog feel. Channel 5 is channel for 2018 with new subtleties. There's slight variations in the algorithm. Channel 6 uses the spiral algorithm instead of just the density algorithm. Channel 7 improved slew clipping, and it let you blend channel 6 and 5. This introduced the point where you could go to 50% and it would be the spiral algorithm, and then go to 100% and it blended between spiral and density for more fatness, so you could dial that in more effectively. Channel 8 is channel 7 with updates from capacitor 2 and slew 3. It's more and better of what channel is. We stopped doing just the auxiliary adjustments to what the processing was doing and went more in just pushing it as far as I could go. Channel 9 is channel 8 with the ultrasonic filtering I now do, and also new TAC and Mackie low-end settings for the options that you get, although that is nothing compared to the Mackie emulation that I did with Mackie, which is much more extreme. Channel 9 is not that, but it's leaning in that direction a little bit more. I'm not done with C yet. Let's go on. Chorus is a mono chorus that also works as a vibrato. Chorus Ensemble is a more complex multi-tap mono chorus. Chrome Oxide is an alternate path to vibey old tape sonics. It's more of a particular kind of fuzz or noise generation. Cider is a re-release of another old character plugin. Clip Only is a clipper plugin that suppresses the brightness of digital clipping without affecting unclipped samples. Coils models the types of distortion you'll find in transformers. If you're looking for transformer modeling, that's the one where I tried to do that. Cojones is a new type of distorty. It was another weird Airwindows invention. Compress Saturator fades between compressing and soft clipping. A lot of people like that one. Console 4 is the original Airwindows in-the-box mixing system. It's a 2-plugin mix bus replacement for DAWs. Console 5 is a richer, warmer console system. Console 6 is a new, more intense console that peaks at lower dB. And I believe Console 5 was the one where there were issues, so you got C5 raw console again. Console 5 is the one that addresses that. That's the one where I'm trying to consoleize the slew rate of the audio, which was an unusual thing that I did not continue to attempt because it was hard to make work. So Console 6 is a new, more intense console that peaks at lower dB. There's a guy on Gearsluts that was pitching ideas to me as far as like reversible saturation algorithms, and that algorithm is from somebody else who was offering me stuff to do. That has not stopped, by the way. That person's still out there, so we're not only dependent upon me for ideas, always. Console 7 is the best console yet with anti-aliasing filtering and special saturation curves. It's my most recent one. Console 7 Cascade is a drop-in replacement for Console 7 Channel that allows for much higher gain, kind of in the way that Mackie allows for a very higher gain relative to like Channel 9. Crunchy Grooveware is a version of Grooveware for more edge and distortion. It is the original Grooveware that was in 2Vinyl in the old days. Crystal is a tone shaper and bus soft clipper. That's another old school one. C-strip is an Airwindows channel strip. Pretty simple. Curve, lowercase, is the simplest, purest form of recurve with no extra boosts. That's an interesting sort of compressy, saturate kind of thing that is a very, very simple, tiny algorithm. Often I like to go for the purest, simplest, fewest mathematical operations you can do on the audio, and Curve is a beautiful example of that. It will just delicately compress stuff the tiniest amount. Dark is a word length reducer that gives your music a blacker backdrop. Oh, back to Curve. One of the things about Curve and Recurve is that it is a kind of gain trim that doesn't do anything when it's gone completely silent. It only adjusts stuff when there's audio to work on. So there's that. So Dark is a word length reducer that gives your music a blacker backdrop. It is currently my preferred version for dithering for things. Dark noise is an alternative method for producing bassier noise directly, sound design stuff. DC voltage is literally a DC control voltage in a plugin. When I have all of these that come out, I'm going to point somebody at Apple towards this and say, here's the simplest possible plugin. What in my Xcode settings is right and what is wrong? Because there will be no audio code in it. It will be just look at the settings. What in this project file looks right to you? So I use DC voltage for that. You could also use it in a DAW if you were using audio files to feed into like other operations or something. dBass is an improved DS with perfect rejection of non-S audio. It's really quite good, dBass is. Dakraka fattens and dirties up beats. That's something that I did for somebody on Gearsource. DS. So DS is, or was, the best de-essing solution there is. It's the go-to utility plugin. dBass took it up a stage, but DS was very popular in its day. You could still want it better than dBass if you happen to like that particular one better, so you get to use both. I don't force you to go on to the new version just because there is a new version. I am continuing to update all the old versions, including making M1 versions of them, which is why we're going through this list. I'm still on the Ds. Dehiss tries to suppress background hiss like a hiss gate. It was designed to deal with a really cheap sort of USB preamplifier thingy. Density is a Swiss Army knife of saturation, anti-saturation. That went into lots of plugins after it was produced. Density 2 is a different color for density, some old code I had that people wanted. Derez is an analog-style bit and sample rate crusher with continuous adjustments, so it is a non-quantized bit crusher. You can crush it to like 8.5 bits if you so choose. Derez 2 brings more authentic retro digital hardware tones. Desk is classic Airwindows subtle analog modeling. DAS 4 is distinctive analog coloration. It's a tunable version of the control-less desk plugins, of which there are other ones other than just desk. Desk with no additional mention is the sort of featureless one that you would just drop in somewhere if you wanted that coloration. Doing that kind of stuff is also a way of getting your DAW to act more like it's a real desk so that you're doing gain staging in various places of it in order to make it operate properly, which is good to learn about. That's good to know how to do. Digital Black is a quick staccato gate. Distance is a sound design or reverb farawayizer. Distance 2 is a versatile space shaper for creating depth. Both of those are like EQ behaviors, except for they're not always exactly. And so if you can get a preferred effect out of one or the other, or both, or some combination. Distortion is a slightly dark analog style distortion with several presets. It's like focus. It's sort of the try all the initial Airwindows distortion algorithms and flip between them if you like. Ditherbox is kind of like that. It's a switchable selection of dithers in 16 and 24-bit plus monitoring tools. That's older than Dark and Beam and stuff, so don't treat it as the newest thing, but it existed back in its day, and I continue to update it in case people like it. Ditherfloat is a demo of floating point truncation, which can also dither to 32-bit float output. Don't use this one. All of these plugins already contain Ditherfloat unless they're like word length shift gain that's not supposed to. Ditherfloat is an algorithm that's in everything here. Correctly set up to dither them all to the 32-bit floating point bus or the 62-bit floating point bus for those VSTs that use it. So this is the demo. This is the one where if you move the slider, you can hear sort of a close-up of what it's doing, kind of like using Derez in one of my dithers, so that it shows you what that sounds like. Otherwise, you'd never be able to hear it. It's too subtle. But yeah, Ditherfloat is a demo of floating point truncation. It's not something that you have to use, much less place between plugins or anything like that. That wouldn't work. Dither Me Timbers is dark, deep, quote-unquote dither, which includes a 16-bit version, Dither Me Discers. And that's another weird word length reduction algorithm. Double Paul is like my Paul dither, which is very simply TPDF high-passed. And it's a lovely algorithm that Paul Frindle came up with and was using on Sony Oxford stuff. I found out about it, and that's why it's called that, because he's a good guy and deserves cred. So Double Paul is like that, but it's even steeper. Drive is the angry distortion. Mind you, that's not the only one I've got. Macady is based on an even more intense version of that kind of stuff. I've elaborated it since then, but Drive I had a long time ago, and it is a very gnarly and crunchy and fierce distortion. Let's see, where are we at? Drum Slam is a heavy processing tape modeler. It's kind of based off of another plugin that was out there a long time ago, and it was one of those times when I was trying to mimic something else that existed, which happened to act like it had sort of 3 bands going on. So Drum Slam, see if you like the sound of it. Dub Center is a version of Dub Sub where the bass reinforcement is purely mono, and Dub Sub is a fully featured bass doctor which does a bunch of things like boosts and thicknesses and a sub-octave and stuff like that. So Dub Center is that, but the stuff that you add is only centered. Dust Bunny is unpredictable distorting noise like dust wedged under your turntable needle. It was an accident. It was a mistake in one of the plugins, and people decided that it was nice and that they liked it, so I needed to make a plugin out of it. Dino is a lot like Mojo, but for intensity instead of loudness. So that is a clipping effect. It's a sort of focused down only the clipping algorithm as a plugin. I think there's not even any controls in it. I'm not sure. But it will give the distortion. I believe this is also in the distortion plugin in case you want to monitor, check it out. But these are weird variations on saturation algorithms that do interesting things. And we're out of the Ds. Remember, I have to update all of these with these various things for each single one of these. Let's continue. Edisdim is mid-side conversion utility plugins. It also includes mid-side. Elation is a re-release of another old character plugin, one that was meant to be kind of like an LA2A and uses a impulse response based on that inside it. It didn't end up being a very good compressor though, but Electro Hat is a hi-hat tone generator that uses the original sound as a control voltage. Pro tip, it would be great if somebody built that into like VCV Rack. Just saying, that could come in handy. Energy is electrifying fixed frequency treble boosts. It's an unusual way of doing a treble boost. It's a weird high energy kind of thing. It sounds rather fake, but man, does it have a lot of voltage behind it. Ensemble is a weird flangy little modulation effect. EQ is just the EQ parts of C-Strip. C-Strip had an EQ built into it that had its own kind of things going on. So EQ is that split out. Every trim is left, right, mid, side, and master in one plugin. So it's a gain trim thing. Facet is a new kind of hard clip that adds 2 sharp corners into the wave. Fathom 5 is a way of supplementing extreme bass that's not just EQ. It is like Bass Kit. It is an early version of that kind of stuff going on. A fair amount of these early Fathom 5 style plugins had issues with kind of trying to bleed DC offset into things because they had so much power in the extreme lows that it was hard to control. I got better at that over the years. But the original versions you can still try if you're game for dealing with something like that. Floor is fake bottom octave for fun and profit. Basically, that is like this weird old Waves plugin that I heard about, but probably not. But it's a way of kind of trying to synthesize a apparent lower octave by distorting things in a particular way. That's floor. floor is like gives you lows while also being able to cut the lows at the same. It's a weird thing. See if you like it, if you unfool with how your lows are produced. Focus brings out clarity by distorting. It is aggressive, subtle, and flexible. It is kind of like the filtering stuff that I do with distortion to suppress aliasing, in that it is isolating a mid-range band, distorting that so that it's not generating aliasing, and then blending back in the isolated other frequencies that weren't getting distorted. So you're kind of focusing and distorting the mid-range frequencies. That's what focus is. It's pretty good for what it does. Fracture is a frequency multiplier wave shaper with a soft disruption to the sound, or a extreme disruption to the sound if you crank it really hard. It's basically a wave shaper. If you've ever heard about wave shaping on like West Coast modular synthesizers and things like that, that's what it is. Basically, if you crank into a sine wave function rather than just clipping, it can go around and reverse itself and become much higher frequencies in a very weird way. That's what Fracture does. From Tape is a minimalist, cleaner analog tape emulations. I'm still on F. But not for long. Galactic is a super reverb designed specially for pads and space ambience. That is quite recent. That's a good one, Galactic is. Gatelope is a special gate that applies filters. It's like an envelope follower gate kind of thing, but without the wall-like excessively resonant frequency thing. That's one that was more of a request by somebody. So what Gatelope does is it opens the gate, and then as it starts to fall off, it starts to also roll off high frequencies as it goes. And it's designed for putting on things like tom-toms, where you'd want the tom to sustain to some extent, but you want it to cut out overheads and cymbals nearby much more drastically. So that's what that does. Glitch Shifter is a really gnarly and raw-sounding pitch shifter with a dose of insanity. Glitch Shifter is a very strange plugin. You can get really crazy things happening out of it. Golem, or as the person who is Slipperman liked that one and liked calling it Golem. I think it's Golem, but whichever. It lets you blend a stereo track of two mics on an amp, or two different things like a DI and a mic. If you have a stereo track, you can convert it to mono and pick which side you favor, and also time delay one or the other sides to match the mics or offset the mics in useful ways to get interesting cancellations. That's what Golem does. It is very good at that. You need to have your sounds captured as a stereo pair in order to do it properly, because it runs on a stereo pair. Gringer is a full wave rectifier plugin like a green ringered guitar effect, so it does that. Grooveware is for scrubbing off highs mechanically like a stylus would. Unlike Crunchy Grooveware, it is debugged to where it doesn't have the slightly gnarly edge, and it softens things much more effectively. So if you're looking for a retro vinyl-like sound, Grooveware might very well be handy. Guitar Conditioner is like a tube screamer voicing without the squishiness and indistinctness. It is sort of an isolated focus of some of the tube screamer style behaviors, but without going into a full-on, oh, analog modeling, let's blur everything out. No. It's got some slew clip, it's got some high pass, it's got stuff like that going on, and it is one of the featureless plugins. There's no controls on it. Just put it on your guitar before you go into your heavy distortion and go from there. Hard Vacuum is tube-style saturation effects. It's quite good in its way. It's got this aura control that gives interesting results. Hermit Pass is a mastering high pass to set by ear only. It is a variation on stuff that I already did along the lines of what a guy that does Hermitech mastering wanted. So when I was doing those, he was going, can you make me one of these? And I was like, well, that's similar to what I've got already. I could. And he would please. And I said, yes, okay. And that was that week's plugin for me. So it was handy. By the same token, Hermit Trim is like every trim, but much finer adjustments. Very small changes, like very little alteration. Every trim does lots of stuff like mid-side and left and right and so on, but it's got a bigger range of adjustment. Hermit Trim is much smaller adjustments. High Impact is distorted grit and punch without fatness. That's one of the classics, it really is. High Gloss Dither is a hybrid between Shiny Dither and Truncation. It's an unnatural science experiment and a bad dither. It really doesn't work. But, you know, if you wanted to apply a dither in such a way that it gave you a strange, unusual effect that sounded different and interesting, there you go. Knock yourself out. High Pass is a time warp for retro mid-rangey sounds. High Pass 2 is I'm not even sure where I got to. High Pass is an old plugin. I'm not sure why I say retro mid-rangey sounds, because if it's a high pass, it clearly should let try it if you want. See whether it sounds like what I described. High Pass 2 is an unusual sounding variable slope high pass filter. That's a little more like what I thought that stuff was about. Holt is a synth-like resonant low pass filter focused on bass frequencies. So Holt is a low pass, but it's a weird low pass. It's an algorithm that somebody that shows up in my chats wanted me to try out because they ran across that in some sort of accountancy software. And it was a way of dealing with data sets. And they're like, what would that sound like as audio? I'd like to hear what that sounds like as audio. So we gave it a shot. And that's Holt. It is, again, resonant low-pass filter, but in a weird way. If you want to do low-pass type things, see whether that does it for you. Hombre is atmosphere and texture through very short delays. It is basically the blurb around that is based off of ZZ Top, so it talks a lot of nonsense and is very cagey and coy about what it really does. But what it really does is two really short delays. One of them is positive, one of them is inverted. So you can turn them up as much as you want, but they're not going to affect the lows going through them, but they do really weird cancellation effects outside of the area where that cancels out. That's Hombre. Infinity is a matrix verb specifically designed to sustain and layer sounds forever. I think Galactic is better at this now, but Infinity is like a household or reverb matrix, being sort of old school reverb sound, but the kind where you can just set it to go forever and it will just infinite reverb sustains forever. It'll sound like old hardware reverbs. Not fancy modern hardware reverbs, but your old school stuff where they had very primitive chips to do it with. Infrasonic is theoretically a very clean, plain, high-quality subsonic filter for using inside digital mixes. That's not really true. It rolls off too fast. It's basically the same thing as ultrasonic, but in the opposite frequency extreme. And when you use a whole bunch of biquad filters stacked up to do that, what you wind up is a bunch of weird phase rotation and stuff, and it'll peak out a lot higher. So basically, if you were to use infrasonic rather than something more normal, it would be because you wanted to continue down to 20 hertz, basically. Get rid of a certain amount of literally subsonic stuff, but also have a bunch of accentuation on the actual 20 hertz stuff, and probably increase the amplitude of your result. So you could use infrasonic as basically sound design. Like if you're doing an earthquake effect, you can throw that on there knowing that it's going to do weird stuff and be kind of obvious, but it's also going to cut some of the lower than 20 hertz information, and it's going to really accentuate stuff and make it sound kind of extreme. So it's, rather than very clean, plain, high quality subsonic filter, I would call it more of like subsonic thunder effect for effect. It will bring attention to the extreme lows in a way that better filters would not. That's infrasonic. Onwards. Because, yep, I have to port all of these to the Mac M1. Did I tell you that? Did I tell you that I had to do all of this stuff to all of these plugins. Let's continue. Interstage is a subtle and sophisticated analogifier. It's a little bit like coils, that it is acting a little bit like a transformer or something. And it's just one of those ones where it does some of the Airwindows tricks to bring stuff into more of a physical hardware type of zone. It does it very subtly, and it doesn't eat the tone of what passes through it. So you can pop it into all different places in your mix if you want it to act like your DAW was a analog desk. You'd go like, okay, I'm going to all these submixes, therefore for each of these submixes I'm going to throw in a interstage, and it's going to just shape and soften things just a tiny bit in these places as things get summed and assembled. And that will contribute towards making the analog sounding mix, is having stuff happen in the right places for the right reasons. Interstage. Iron Oxide 5 is the old school heavily colored Airwindows tape emulation. Iron Oxide Classic is the purer, simpler, early form of Iron Oxide before all the features, so it's very primitive. Iron Oxide Classic 2 is more recent. It's another one that I just updated to fix some initialization code that was in there. It's the Bandapassi tape sim, updated for high sample rate, and the kind of alias and control that I do. So it's designed so that you would use Iron Oxide Classic 2 if you wanted to run at 96K and get a really more organic tone out of that, while not losing the tone of the original Iron Oxide Classic. There are some changes. It reevaluated the way that it sort of gain staged as a result of doing the things that I did. It gives a more accurate picture of what Iron Oxide does when run at high sample rates, but it also distorts easier when you set it to act like it's a very slow tape effect. So beware, it might not be the one that you want necessarily. If you were fooling with Iron Oxide Classic specifically, I would try both. I'm going to try to make the update to Iron Oxide 5 more closely mimic what the original plugin does. But Iron Oxide Classic 2 is a bit of a departure. It distorts more easily on slow tapes. Isolator is a steep high-pass or low-pass filter like you might find in a speaker crossover. Logical 4 is a classic 2-bus compressor. Hey, we're on the L's. Loud is distortion and demolition of air molecules Loud is distortion and demolition of air molecules modeled. So it's a kind of distortion. It's a weird kind of asymmetrical distortion that is similar to what happens in air when you just obliterate it super hard. I got loud by analyzing what happened in YouTube videos and stuff of things like tractor pulls and things where there's a recording that was a reasonably good recording of what happens when you have like 6 dragster engines on a giant tractor that's trying to pull a 27 million ton weight along a field. Those are loud, and they give you a fairly good example of what happens when air literally distorts. What's the limits of literal air? Loud is for doing that. Low pass deepens the tone and leaves a gloss and textural modifications. Like high pass, it's got some funny alterations to it that you can dial in strange little colorations into what you're doing with it. Low pass 2 is an unusual sounding variable slope low pass filter. I think that's a fairly similar thing to that. The ones that I call high pass and low pass are sort of the Airwindows versions of those things. LR Flip Timer is another request. It's the utility that swaps left with right every few, as in 1 to 10 or so minutes. And the idea was you'd put that on your mix bus, and if you mixed using panning in certain ways, it would flip it every now and then, and you'd be able to hear if you were doing something crazy or wrong. This is something that artists do when they're drawing stuff, is you'll flip the canvas and see whether anything looks crazy all of a sudden. So the idea is audio version of that. Luxor is a re-release of another old character plugin. Luxor, I believe, is the one that was based on a Manly Massive Passive, but I'm not absolutely sure. Anyways, it's one of those old character plugins. It's basically a form of dynamically convolved impulse response thing. Luxor. Mackie, hey, that's the most recent one. Emulation of the input stage of a vintage Mackie 1202 going into the input and the very high amount of gain on tap and coming out of the insert point. So it's not the entire thing. I've got one of those coming up, but I've got, as you might be able to tell, a little porting to the new version of Audio Unit to do. Let's keep going. Matrix Verb is a wildly adjustable, strangely colorful reverb for deep and flexible spaces. That's basically true. I think that the verbity that I've done demolishes it sonically, but Matrix Verb is still very adaptable. You can do a bunch of weird things with it. You can do a sort of weird platy effect. You can do a sort of weird springy effect. There's a bunch of stuff that Matrix Verb can do. Melt is a wobbly, chorusy, weird diffuse effect. It's like 5 different vibratos and delays at the same time. Just goes weird and crazy. Mojo is a biginator that also works as a loudinator. It's one of those new styles of distortion effect. Again, the plugin Distortion will let you check that out in a more controlled circumstance. Mojo is one of the ones where it's just only the algorithm isolated in a plugin, maybe not even any inputs and outputs and stuff, just the only the thing. Monitoring is your one-stop shop for final 2-bus work. That lives in the Starter Kit collection. Monitoring is a very useful plugin to have. It will dither to the floating point bus while you're listening through it. It'll give you 24-bit and 16-bit outputs. It'll give you a bunch of different things that you can check stuff out on, which I'll be talking about in future plugins as I continue onwards through this alphabetical list. It'll even let you do the voice trick thing, where it'll switch everything to mono, but with one of the phases flipped. So if you have a microphone placed in exactly the right place, the speakers you're listening to will cancel out in the microphone, and you can sing into them while listening to stuff in the room and have it more or less work. Monitoring has that too. So it's a very handy thing. Monome gives you variations on mono, mid, and side in different channels. I don't remember exactly what the heck this one did, but it was one of those request ones. Please give me this thing that does this bounced into different channels, or what. You can probably look up what I said about it on the website if you want to know what monome was. I think the person asking for it was Gnome. MV is a dual mono reverb based on word length shift gain and the old MIDI verbs. And that's a very useful thing that I'll probably be able to get more out of. It's all pass filters in a chain, like the MIDI verb bloom algorithm. But the old MIDI verbs did not have multiplies and math, and so what they had to do was do all of their gain trim operations in 6 dB increments. The old MIDI verbs, that's what they had to do. And when you do that in 60 dB increments, you're changing only the exponent of the floating point number. So it is a very high purity gain trim in the digital domain. So the old MIDI verbs, as sound died away, there was a mysterious lack of aliasing or any kind of quantization. It would just very, very slick, that stuff, although it's also very limiting. MV does that. MV does a kind of all-pass filter that's doing that in the same way that the MIDI verbs had that on tap, but they were forced to do their all-pass filter in a non-all-pass filter kind of way because they didn't have multiply units in them. That's MV. Naturalized Dither is deterministic dither that uses Benford realness calculations for each sample. Don't use this because naturalized dither is the same thing that became NJAD, Not Just Another Dither, and that became several new versions of Not Just Another Dither. And the most recent, I think, lived in the plugin Studio Tan, and in, if I'm not mistaken, monitoring. And then my preferred dither going forwards is actually dark. I don't remember whether I've updated monitoring to include dark or not, but I'll probably call that monitoring 2 when I do. And then let monitoring 1 still be available, as I do. So Naturalized Dither, that's the early version. There's some bugs in it. It doesn't work exactly the same, but people who wanted to use it or liked that particular variation on the sound get to still have it. NC17 is dirty loud. NC17 is just loudness maximization. You never need to use this anymore, but if you want it, it's still there. Neverland is a re-release of my old Neve-style color adder out of the character plugins, exactly as it was. Nicola is a audio Tesla coil plugin. This is not as cool as you'd think. Tesla coils in real life used for audio purposes, a lot of that is the fact that it's so loud that it distorts your ear. And a lot of that is the fact that it is in a reverberant space. So if you just make a plugin to try to do stuff like that, it doesn't sound nice, it's ugly. But it is there, so Nicola, you can try if you would like. Node Dither is just a TPDF dither, like a dither flanger. It can do Paul Dither and tape dither settings. And basically what you're doing is you're taking the 2 noise sources and delaying one of them, or delaying and inverting one of them. But the delay isn't necessarily just one sample, it could be other samples. And that'll give you different colorations on the noise floor. And they're all equally effective at being TPDF, because they all follow the rules of what TPDF must do. But the sound of the noise floor can be very different. So that's a way of doing a TPDF dither and like dial your own noise floor tone, as it were. That's Node Dither. Noise is the Airwindows deep noise oscillator as a sound reinforcer. So it's a noise generator, as it were. Nonlinear space is a flexible reverb plugin. That's sort of an old school reverb plugin. Not Just Another Dither is a next-gen word length reducer. It's 24 and 16-bit. Also, we've got DRes in there. That's the case for a lot of the dithers. And it's no longer the most recent gen, but it's still a very interesting approach. So Not Just Another Dither has been very popular with people. It's a little livelier than Dark. Dark is very much about making the noise, the background of the sound, get as black and silent as you can get it. And it's very good at refining the tonality in that way. But Not Just Another Dither, there's a little more air to it. There's maybe more of a spatial feeling to it. So you get to choose. One corner clip is a ultimate full bandwidth clipper. What that means is the way that it works is it softens the entry into clipping, and you can dial it in such a way that it emphasizes different frequencies as it goes. So you can get very different tonalities out of one corner clip. It's an unusual algorithm. Pafnutty is a Chevy Chev filter that adds harmonics. That's an old one. But it is a Pafnutty, that's your Chevy Chev filter. If you pass sine waves into it at exactly the right level, which is like -1 to 1, 0 dB sine wave, you will get other sine waves out of it, other frequencies out of it, because that's what a Chevy Chev filter does. Paul Dither is a high-pass TPDF dither, which is quieter and airier. Again, that's because Paul Frindle was doing that in Sony Oxford and talked about it publicly and deserves the cred, or deserves shout-outs regardless of whether he was the one that invented it. I think I've heard him say that he didn't actually invent that, but all the same, it's called Paul Dither. PD console, that's console and Purist drive, both at once. The console and Purist drive sitting in a tree, it's combining them on both the channels and the bus. The console 5 algorithm without the Slew stuff, so it behaves itself, and Purist drive as an algorithm are combined. That's PD console. Peaks only is in monitoring, and it is a transformative mix check tool. What that means is it will completely mutate the sounds going through it. It'll be unrecognizable, it'll be crazy and weird, but one of the things that will happen is that if you have loads of peak energy sneaking through, especially if you're on headphones, and you're not taking it into account because peak energy kind of gets by you and you don't hear it directly, peaks only will alter and twist that into where you're hearing roughly the loudness that the peak energy is doing. So if certain sounds, like a snare or some particular tonality or frequency range, is too loud, but it's all peak energy rather than RMS, so you're not hearing it directly, peaks only will turn it into something that you can hear directly, and it will be obviously louder. And then you can adjust the thing until it settles down and you have more of a balance. And if stuff balances using peaks only, you can go back to the regular mix and it's going to be more, it'll work in more contexts. Like it'll be something that'll work over speakers even if you weren't able to hear that on headphones and so on. That's peaks only. Very useful tool. Phase Nudge is a phase rotator and all-pass filter. That's handy to have. It's subtle, but it's nice. Pocket Verbs is my popular old special effects reverbs plugin. I would hope to never make a plugin like this again, because it's a whole pile of elaborate and sort of manually coded algorithms all in one plugin. It takes 20 times longer to compile than any of my other plugins because there's so much code in it and it's huge. I'd prefer to have the individual things in separate plugins these days. But Pocket Verbs, that's the one. It's got stuff like Zarathustra, which is a giant, dark, huge reverb that sounds like it's infinitely far away and stuff. That's Pocket Verbs. Pocket Verbs has lots of weird things in it. Podcast is a simpler pile of curve-style compressors with hard clipping. That is, it's going to try to level set without sounding like a compressor, so it's going to try to sound more like a general gain averaging. It's one of those ones where you're supposed to not have it squishing and pumping and breathing, but instead it should just make everything sit at roughly the same level. And it has hard clipping so that you can't blast it, even if your signal goes super loud. PodcastDeluxe is a pile of compressors, curve style, like Podcast, but with phase rotators, so it manipulates the sound even more intensely. That's also one that I have just updated because the initialization on the VST version was not the best. So if you did try it and it did weird things at you, I probably just fixed that. Point is a explosive transient designer. I'm going to need to revisit this one because I could make interesting things out of it. But Point, as it currently exists, is probably capable of blowing up your mix real good. It's one of those really early plugins where if you know how to use it, maybe you can get wonderful effects out of it. And if you don't know how to use it, beware, it'll do terrible, terrible things to you. So that's Point. Very old school Airwindows plugin right there. Pop is a crazy overcompressor with a very exaggerated sound. It was designed around that sort of Phil Collins running a microphone into an old Alan Heath PA system limiter kind of thingy. And Pop was meant to make those sounds, or at least try very hard. So it does a very exaggerated sound. It's probably another good candidate for putting aliasing suppression filters in there, all in my copious free time, obviously. That's Pop. Pop is an interesting compressor to try. Power sag is for emulating power supply limitations in analog modeling. So that's also what was present in the Desk plugins as they came out. PowerSag 2 is my improved Circuit Star plugin, now with inverse effect, so you can not only cut the sort of mid-range area for power soaking stuff, but you could also boost it if you wanted. It's a bit of a grungy effect though, so again, another good candidate for filtering. Precious is a re-release of another old character plugin. Again, those are the there's an impulse response in there and it's making a tone coloring. It's like a color adder. Preponderant is fairly recent. It's Airwindows Anti-Soothe. It's a strange tone intensifier and balancer. What this one does is it acts like ResEQ, which I recently updated. Today I updated. And it focuses the sound into 3 resonant bands. But what it's doing with that is it tries to make the bands be roughly equal volumes at all times, no matter what they are, and no matter what the input source is. So you use preponderant by dialing in a tone using these resonant bands in such a way that it's doing useful things in your mix. And then it works to try to keep all of those tone colors present at the same amount. But they're still resonant bands. So that makes it the anti-soothe. And the way that it's compensating to try to make those be balanced at all times is what makes it be like a soothe. That's as close as you're going to get to a soothe from me. Pressure 4 is a compressor adjustable between Very Mu and New York peak retaining behaviors. So Pressure 4, which has always been a very popular plugin, you get to make it do sort of extra squish, or you can get to do it so that it acts like a parallel compression thing. It's one of the older ones, but it worked out very well. Pressure 4 is worth looking at if you're interested in compressors. Purest Air is a brightness experiment. It'll make stuff brighter, obviously. Purest Console is the most free from coloration console system until Purest Console 2 is the anti-aliasing version of Purest Console with special brightness and clarity, and that does interesting things with the filtering, in that this is the one where it's dialed in so that there's a bit of a presence lift, but it's not quite within the human hearing range. And that also lets it roll off faster as you go past the area and start suppressing aliasing prone frequencies. So Purest Console 2 should be even more free from coloration if you're running at a high sample rate. If you're not, maybe you'd prefer to just run Purest Console and be done with it. It'll be more CPU efficient if you do. Purest Drive is the magic saturation plugin of subtlety and French house tone. Well, until I released Macady, which is literally that. But anyway, Purest Drive, saturation plugin. It has its own kind of tone going on. It went over pretty well. People liked it. Purest Echo is optimized Airwindows Echo with exactly 4 evenly spaced taps on tap. So the idea with that was that you'd be able to dial in a particular kind of slapback, but then after you hit the echoes and got the most out of that slapback, it would just sort of go away again. So you could call it Purest Echo, or you can call it, yeah, this is one of those ones that just does 4 quick slapbacks and is gone. It's Purest Echo. See if you like it. Purest Fade is just like Purest Gain, but for long fades. Purest Gain is a high-res noise-shaped gain with a smoothed fader. 2 smooth faders specifically. It's got a fader that goes to 0, which is slowed down. So Purest Fade is that, but with the fader that goes to 0, even slower, so that it will sort of fade for you if you want it to. And it's just a very seamless motion that way. They both have a gain trim control on them that operates in dB. And then the one that goes to 0, which is the one that is more smoothed in case you're like writing adjustments and things like that. Probably you will prefer either Purest Fade or Purest Gain. Purest Squish is a open sounding compressor with some bass bloom to it. So it's a compressor. See if you like the sound of this compressor. Purest Warm is a subtle tone shaper and warmth adder. What that means is it's a density style clipper, but it only clips one side of the waveform. That's what Purest Warm does. You get to pick which side of the waveform you're clipping. But that's what it does, is it's clipping one side of the waveform and not clipping the other side. PyWacket is a old school compressor for high definition transients. It adds no fatness, just energy. What that means is this is a compressor that goes between full volume and the density algorithm set to the most leaned out kind of thing. What the density algorithm does when you go to negative density is it starts taking the quieter sounds away and leaving only the spikiest peaks. So that's Pyewacket. When you do that in a compressor, what you get is it's taken away fatness and it's leaving some edge, and any transient peaks in your compressed sound are going to be more accurate because there's less being done to them. They're being allowed to come through, and that makes Pyewacket have a, like, it's not good at making squished fat sounds, but it's very good at stepping on the level of things in a subtle and controllable way while leaving lots of sort of old school energy going on. So Pyewacket is for leaving transient energy in rather than being like a limiter and taking transient energy out. Pyewacket. Raw timbers is just the quantization from dither timbers, and the opposite as a brightener. So that's one of those weird ones again. Recurve is a special bus compressor with no threshold point. So that's basically the curve algorithm that compresses stuff as long as sound is happening. If it goes silent, it's not going to continue bringing stuff up. It'll be sort of a gain level adjuster. It's very subtle with that. And Recurve has a bit of a boost to it, but it's not a large boost. It's something of a boost. I think it actually went towards your word length shift gain thing, where if you're not compressing, you're getting 6 dB of boost, because if you're not compressing, that is a completely seamless boost that is going to be very high resolution. It is a bit shift. So the exponent of the signal changes and the mantissa doesn't get altered, and then it'll kick in regular gain change when the compressor kicks in. Recurve. Remap puts the guts back into overloudinated audio. Remap is bringing transients back to stuff that has been distorted in, I think, a crude kind of way. I don't remember how well this worked, but that's what it's for. ResEQ is a bank of mostly mid-range resonances, and it's one that I fixed today. ResEQ gave problems to people who tried it that were using the VST version of it. I have now fixed that, so it should behave itself when you instantiate it now. It's mid-range resonances. It's resonant peaks, and it's about 6 or 8 of them or something. So you just spread them out, and you make a somewhat unusual sound out of all these very resonant peaks that combine with each other. And that sits in the mix smoother than your full bandwidth sound. So it's a strange thing to do, but it's a thing to do. It's like having 8 different wah pedals all at once. Reverb is my great folly. It's simplified and tuned matrix verb, adjusting everything for each optimum verb size. So basically what this does is it's like a one knob reverb, and you got a dry wet thing, and then you've also got a size, and the size will change all these different things about matrix verb to where it'll be the most realistic sound at any given setting, except for that verbity sounds way more realistic than it no matter what you do. So it's kind of like, oops. Reverb, if you want the artificial reverb, householder reverb sound, but you'd like to seamlessly dial between a bunch of reasonably plausible Hall sizes in doing that. Oh, and if you move it, it makes crashing noises because it's changing the buffer sizes and stuff. What are you going to do? That's reverb for you. Righteous 4. Hey, we're almost done with the R's. Remember, I have to do all of these as the new audio unit compiles, and I have to do all of these changes to every single one. Righteous 4 is a final output stage for targeting dynamic range. It was based around when the Pono came out, and Neil Young was pushing that. And the idea was you'd run Righteous 4 on your mix bus, mix into it. It's your final output stage. It even contains the Naturalized Dither. So you would not use monitoring or dither after this because it included all of those things. It was your final everything. And it was set up so that if you went too loud into it, it would obviously distort and sound strange. So you just dial back until the stuff sounded okay and didn't sound too distorted. And that would be letting through peak energy. But it would kind of saturate the RMS level and keep it to what would work for like replay gain or Apple's mastering or YouTube's new volume things where they started turning people down when they were too loud. Righteous would keep you from running into that problem. It would make you mix to about the right gain level. That's Righteous for. Side dull is like side pass, but a low pass on the side channel. So it is a treble centerer. That's a weird thing to do, but somebody asked me for it because side pass is a simple utility plugin. It is a simple high pass on the side channel. It's a mono maker. You can monoize stuff that way. And that is side pass. I believe Hermit pass is a similar thing, but in a different way. But side pass is one of those ways of doing that type of thing. It's a simple Airwindows high pass on the side channel. That's what that one is for. Single-ended triode is unusual analog modeling effects. By that I mean you've got a Class A distortion generator, which is not like Purest Warm. The Class A distortion generator is more like density but scaled up and offset, so that you start turning up the single-ended triode control and you start getting this very, very fluid second harmonic generation. It's just on a big curve. And you start generating second harmonic with like barely anything else. It's a tone sweetener in a peculiar way. That is single-ended triode. It also comes with Class AB and Class B distortion, which are very much the opposite kind of thing. Class AB gives you a kind of gnarly grit. It's really good for things like Hammond organs and stuff, because I think some of those were made that way. And you can also get particular kind of like grungy old Marshall stack sounds. Any giant old tube amp that had push-pull circuitry, and maybe there's a particular amplifier that's like, oh, this amplifier is a magic tone because it's especially gnarly. Well, the reason it's gnarly is because its crossover is not calibrated properly and the tubes are going on it or something like that. So it just has this extreme weird grunge that could be generated by Class AB distortion. And single-ended triode contains a distortion like that. There is also a guitar stomp box called the Machine that generates Class B distortion. So the Class B distortion in single-ended triode will do that. It's a much harder clipping that does that crossover distortion as you pass through zero. It's extremely ugly. Try it and see if you like it. That is the three things that are contained in single-ended triode. Slew is, I just updated it, although I don't think it was I think it behaved itself pretty well, but there was still an update. It is a slew clipper. It darkens treble in an unusual way, kind of grindy sort of thing. And this is the type of slew clipping that exists in Channel, all the versions of Channel. Slew 2 works like a de-esser or acceleration limiter. It controls extreme highs. This is the same thing done with my weird aliasing oversampling thing that I did back in the day, like maybe 10 years ago. I was trying to do that kind of stuff, and I came up with a really weird thing, and it wasn't actually good, but it was real different. And when I applied it to the slew clipper, I got a completely different behavior. That's what Slew 2 is. It is sort of sample rate restricted in that if you're running at 40.1K, you're going to get the most mileage out of it. And it just has a particular type of high frequency darkening that is very effective. I've never been able to reproduce it. Slew 2 is that plugin. Slew 3 is a new approach to slew clipping meant for a more analog-like darkening effect. Basically, the deal with that is trying to manage to do the Slew 2 thing, but with all forms of sample rates and all forms of... It's yet another Slew restrictor, yet another high-frequency controller, and it is a third sound. I'm not going to say whether it's better or worse than Slew 2, but it is Slew 3. It is its own unique sound going on. Slew Only is a mix check plugin that shows you only the extreme highs. That's the simplest plugin you could possibly ask for. It is a very primitive plugin. And Slew Only exists in monitoring. You can use it to listen to what is only in your highs in your mix, just to sort of check that out and be like, what does it sound like if I can if it's like a cell phone or something and you can only hear just the brightest noises ever. That's Slew Only. Smooth can tame pointy sounds or make drums explode. Smooth is a neat sort of compressy kind of thing going on there, and it has its good points. It's another compressor style thing. Softgate is a gate that can mute hiss and smooth sample tails. It was designed for making sample collections where you'd have it so that it would gate open and you'd have your whole sound going on, and then it's a little bit like Gate-a-lope in that it's designed so that it will shut down and give you a silent cutoff to your samples, so that if you have stuff going on and you maybe have a very long decay tail, rather than have stuff get completely overwhelmed by hiss as you went, you'd use Softgate, set it up to noise gate stuff and filter your samples for you, and it would make there be less sort of hiss buildup on multiple samples being combined. Spatialized Dither is a high-performance clarity and accuracy dither. It's a sort of precursor to the Not Just Another Dither stuff that I did. It's neat sounding. It sounds kind of cool. I'm not sure it's a great dither, but it is one of the dithers, so there's Spatialized for you. Spiral is the new best smoothest distortion algorithm. It is a way of taking the density algorithm, which is just sine wave smoothness, smoothest clip you can possibly have, which does limit aliasing. If you don't have a sharp corner to hit, you get less aliasing that way. You generate the harmonics one at a time. Well, Spiral smooths that out even more by having the center area where you're crossing zero be minimized as much as possible, so there's no change of rate at that point. So it's sort of it's less fat sounding than the density algorithm. Spiral 2 is Spiral with controls, including a presence control. I don't exactly remember how the presence control works, but it's there. So you've got another form of distortion thing there in Spiral 2. Seriously is a psychoacoustic stereo processor by request that's like the old Hughes SRS thing, except for not really so much, because all it does is a particular kind of frequency peak thing that a Popular Mechanics article said that the old SRS did. And it applies just that. So it's a very subtle application of a spatializer. Seriously, the original Seriously is that very subtle spatializer for things like maybe if you're recording like an orchestra or something like that, you've got a stereo recording that needs to not be trashed too much. You could use Seriously on that. Or, as the person wished, Seriously 2 is a revisit of Seriously to make the stereo widening more extreme as the physical device did. So if you were looking for that old Hughes SRS stuff in order to crank it out and make stuff be hallucinatory, crazy wide and weird, Seriously 2 is the one you want. And it was nice to get there finally after a fairly long period in which I hadn't really gotten it because I didn't do all the craziness. I just did some of the initial effect. StarChild is a weird digital ambience echo plugin, and I've also updated that one today. It is sort of based off of an old Ursa Major space station, at least the concept of it. If I had one, and it's not unthinkable that I'll get one at some point and then do a StarChild 2 that's really accurate, but it's based on the concept of this old weird echo ambience device. Stereo Effects is an aggressive stereo widener. It has a variety of ways of making stuff crazy wide, and it's pretty good at doing that. It's always been pretty successful that way. Studio Tan is all the non-dither dithers, up to date and convenient. That's not actually true anymore, but it is Dither Me Timbers, Studio Tan, which is another approach. It's an opposite of Dither Me Timbers, and Not Just Another Dither in one package. For a while there, it was the best way that you could get a hold of the Not Just Another Dither, although now Monitoring has that as well. But it's a dither plugin. You get to switch between several different ones like that. Subs Only is a mix check plugin that shows you only the extreme lows and saturates them in an interesting way. So Subs Only lives in monitoring. It's one of the things that you can do in monitoring to check your mix and see how things balance. And like Slew Only, Subs Only is calibrated volume-wise so that if you have a really good balance, if you kick on Subs Only, it shouldn't blow up your mix and be impossibly too loud. Just like if you have a good mix and switch on Slew Only, it shouldn't blow up your mix and be insanely too loud or insanely too quiet. It'll be a wildly different balance, frequency-wise, but the general amplitude of things should more or less sit about right. In addition, since Subs Only is so heavy and sort of saturated, if you switch to it, it should show you whether there are subsonic things going on in your mix that are out of control. Like if you can still hear everything that's supposed to be happening in the lows when you have Subs Only turned on, that probably means they're working okay. Surge is a compressor for accentuating beats and pulses. I have dinner to make. I'm starving. I need to get through this. Remember, I'm talking my way through all of these. And I have to do all of the stuff on this paper for each one of these. So yeah, 2 weeks, right? That's always the promise, right? It'll be ready in 2 weeks. We'll see. Surge is a compressor for accentuating beats and pulses. It is much like the one that follows. Surge Tide is a surge and flow dynamics plugin. Both of these are using a form of compression where the amplitude coming in is affecting the rate of change of the plugin. So Surge and Surge Tide are compressors that cannot react quickly. All they can do is add a sort of throbbing or a swell to the amplitude. They can't kick in and act like a limiter. They're the opposite of a limiter. But both Surge and Surge Tide are the cleanest compression you're ever going to see if you can get them to do anything useful at all. You might not be able to. Maybe the mix that you're working with isn't doing stuff where there's general shifts in loudness, but they should be able to handle shifts in loudness so that things will more or less sit or wave in a certain way. You can get a kind of motion going with them that is a subtle thing. I think it's going to mostly be a subtle thing. But the way that it works means that they produce the gentlest possible shifts in amplitude, which also transfers to what aliasing is. In a compressor, aliasing happens when you abruptly change the amplitude of things to compensate for louder levels coming in. So Surge and Surge Tide are without doubt the most unaliasing compressors you're ever going to see. And they're almost incapable of reacting to transient attacks coming in. That's Surge and Surge Tide. I couldn't tell you which one will work better for any given thing that you're doing because I forget, but they both work that way. Swell is dial and attack, like sidechaining. What Swell does is you can set it up so that it suppresses attacks coming in, opposite of surge and surge tide, and only builds up to the sound as the sound continues. So silence means the opposite of compression. Silence means it goes to silence, and then as sound comes in, it lets the amplitude go up to full crank again. So you can use swell to chop the attacks off of stuff that's happening. But since it's like a plugin, rather than being, doing it with an LFO or something like that, it will interact with the sound that you're giving. So if you have a more organic sound and you're trying to do that sort of thing, it'll be more of an organic effect as well. It'll adapt itself to whatever it is that you're doing. So that is swell. Sound swells up if you use it. So tape is simplified all-purpose tape mojo, which is my personal jam. In other words, I designed it so that there was only one fader on it and you just slam it more to go. And then I had to redesign it to add another fader because I had too much bass boost in there. There was too much head bump. So there's an additional fader that is the amount of head bump in there. When I revisit it, I might actually simplify it down again, because that was for me doing the tape effect that had nothing to it other than a gain level going in. It might even be worth doing one that acts just as your final output gain. You'd set it on the output and it would stop stuff from clipping by soaking up things in the way that tape might do. I don't know. We'll get into that later. Tape delay is an old school tape echo. That means it's like iron oxide with pitch swerve effects. So tape delay, it's got some funky things going on, and that also could do with the revisiting. But the tape delay is your iron oxide style tape echo. And you can also make it go darker as the regeneration goes, or you can make it go brighter as the regeneration goes. There's a bunch of funky things you can do with it. Tape dither is TPDF dither with noise like reel-to-reel tape. It is a TPDF dither with a particular kind of delay between the noise sources so that it gives a particular kind of roll-off. I think tape dither interacts with different sample rates by acting kind of like they were different tape speeds. In other words, if you're at 44.1K and you do tape dither, it'll be like a 7.5 EEPS hiss. And then if you're going to 96K, it's going to act more like a 30 EEPS hiss. That's tape dither. It's similar to no dither or whatever. It's a TPDF. Tape dust is just a special treble erode noise. It is a slew noise type plugin. I'm pretty sure what I did with this one is that it's a slew limiter, but there's randomness in there. So it's darkening, but it's also going to generate a kind of hissy noise as it goes. But it generates that noise only out of the high frequency suppression that's in there. So it's tape dust is kind of like chrome oxide or something in that it is a dirty analog of fire. It is a like let's add some crunch and mulch and stuff to things. That's tape dust. Tape fat is the tone control from tape delay. Again, it's kind of iron oxide like, without any low frequency boost or anything like that. It's a very focused little algorithm. Thunder is one of the compressors. It is a compressor that retains or exaggerates subsonic bass when you push it. So Thunder is a compressor where it hangs onto the super low bass. That's the intention there. 2 mono, and there's 2 plugins that you find under the names of left to mono and right to mono. Copy one channel to both losslessly. That's all they do. So left to mono, left is now left and left. And that's what you get in the output, the stereo output. Or right to mono, now you've got right and right. It just copies it over. I had that going on because I had to need to do it in OBS. And I had a input source that was giving me the input in only one side. And so it just, bloop, it copies it straight over. You pick the right one and you're good to go. Tone slant is a super transparent tilt EQ with very low Q. I forget all the details of how I made this one work, but it is basically just slant EQ rather than a cutoff frequency that moves. And honestly, Baxandall is also pretty good at that, but Tone Slant was intended for this purpose. So very, very low Q on that one, very transparent sounding. 2Tape 5 is Airwindows analog tape emulation, and TubeTape 6 is analog Airwindows tape emulation for 2020. And we're going to be seeing 2Tape 7 eventually. But you know, you can still use the other two tapes if you would like. 2Vinyl 4 is a vinyl mastering simulator bringing several vinyl type colors. What that means is you have two separate high passes. One of them is on the mid and the other is on the side, much like, you know, side pass is a roll-off, except for the 2Vinyl 4. It's a slightly resonant high pass, honestly. The way that it works, it's kind of accentuating the cutoff point a little bit. So choose wisely, see if you like it. And 2Vinyl 4 also includes the Crunchy Grooveware algorithm and acceleration. Acceleration, remember when we were in the A's? Acceleration is right up top there, and 2Vinyl is where acceleration first appeared. It is not only the side pass, the elliptical EQ like you'd use in vinyl mastering, but it's also got the acceleration limiter like you'd use in vinyl mastering, and then it has the Crunchy Grooveware in case you're not really vinyl mastering, but instead you just wanted to make stuff sound super vinyl recordy and go to a digital output format. So if you were really using vinyl mastering, honestly, you might want to look into the individual things like acceleration and side pass rather than trying to use TubeVinyl for that. It's an older plugin, but also at all costs, if you were doing real vinyl mastering, don't use Grooveware or Crunchy Grooveware. Let the real record do the Grooveware for you. But if you're trying to fake it, Crunchy Grooveware is there, and it'll make stuff sound even more record-like. TPDF Dither is TPDF Dither. 16 24-bit output and a DRes control. My TPDF Dither is kind of interesting because the way that it works out, it sits at about a half of a least significant bit of offset because of the way that it's done. So the TPDF covers 3 values in its noise rather than only 2. And that means that when it's producing delicate sounds down in the noise floor, they've got a little more to work with. You have more of a range for them to fade into the silence. And it sounds a little bit more better while also being a TPDF and while also having, oh gasp, the terrible sin of producing half a least significant bit of DC offset. Ooh. Anyway, that's TPDF Dither. I eventually figured out what it was that some folks were like, this sounds better than other TPDF Dithers. Why? And also, why is this producing this strange result? So that's TPDF for you. Transdesk is one of the desk plugins. We're getting towards the end here. Remember, I have to port all of these, but this is what you get when I have finally finished doing the M1 versions of everything. Transdesk is more of a transistory rock desk analog modeling, and it has slew, and it has a subtle high passing, kind of like channel, and it has that power sag stuff. There in the P's, remember? It has that power sag algorithm in it. And Transdesk uses the power sag at a much higher frequency to simulate what your big transistorized analog desks might do. That additional kind of zing going on by having the fluctuations to the power circuitry be more sort of decentralized and higher frequency in area. Tremolo is fluctuating saturation curves for a 2B tremolo. What that means is you can boost and cut volume, but it's using that density algorithm. So it will get louder and a little bit more saturated, and it'll get quieter and a little more leaned out. It's not just only a volume amplitude. It is a saturation amplitude, so it can sound more, I don't know, tube amp-like for some cases. And you might want to try that if you're doing a tremolo in, for instance, a in-the-box guitar sound or something. Might be right up your alley. Mind you, the tremolos that I've got, they are not synchronized to the tempo, so treat it as just a free-running low-frequency oscillator and go at it from there. Tremol Square is a square wave tremolo effect that only switches on 0 crossings. So with that one, it goes between full volume and silence, but it'll only switch back and forth as the signal crosses 0. So it has this warm organic quality to it, and it's really neat. I have modular synthesizer stuff from WMD that does that. It's the digital VCA, and that is essentially the same thing. You could plug a square wave into one of those and it would do exactly this. It will only switch on 0 crossings. So now you've got it as a plugin. Congrats. Triple Spread is a stereo tripler with extra wideness and glitch shifter processing. So it is essentially glitch shifter, but rather than just doing weird pitch shifty stuff, it's going to take one channel and make it go a little bit sharp, one channel make it go a little bit flat, and then it's going to take the center, and that's your raw signal, and it's going to try to do those offsets. But since it's glitch shifter, you can make it get a little bit weird as far as where it's switching around. It's not going to be like a very smooth lexicon style pitch shift, but it's going to be a kind of raw, direct, immediate sounding pitch shift that sputters and hiccups and bounces around. And you also get to, since it is glitch shifter processing, you can tighten it up until it's making a gnarly, weird, grating, ugly noise. That's triple spread. It's your one side up, one side down, middle is standard kind of thing for making a doubler or tripler effect. Tubedesk, like Transdesk, is a tube recording console type tone coloring. It's based on the old desk stuff, so it is a saturation, and it's a slew limit, and it's got the power sag thing inside it, and it's got a bit of a high pass in there. It's kind of like Channel in its way. That's Tubedesk. Tubedesk is a very old plugin, and it went over fairly well. It's one of those ones that it doesn't have any controls. You just sit it in your DAW and run stuff through it to have it sound a little bit more like something. And we come to the most important plugin of all, ULaw, which is a console-like encode-decode pair, but much more extreme. It is the ULaw effect, encoding and decoding in such a way where you could encode this way, send it through a very high noise context, then decode it, and a lot of the noise will go away because it's just squishing stuff super hard and then unsquishing it again. So if you don't do anything between those two plugins, it won't do anything. It encodes and decodes perfectly. If you do anything between those two plugins, stuff goes crazy. It is a very, very aggressive combination. And in theory, you could use it like console, but I would say, goodness gracious, don't, because it's going to be a complete nightmare. But yeah, that's ULaw for you. Some people, a friend of mine named David Pixley, enjoy this plugin enormously. If you like sort of meltdown, crazy noise generation, make stuff go insane in your DAW type things, you probably end up liking this plugin a whole lot. It's its own special little thing. Ultrasonic is a very clean, plain, high-quality supersonic filter for using inside digital mixes. This is the more exaggerated version of what I do in lots of new plugins. You can put this inside stuff, but I think it's overkill. It is a number of poles of biquad filter. Ultrasonic is really steep. As such, it's cutting off exactly at 20K, and since it is not a phase linear filter, you will hear it modifying the phase way up top. So it is a whack everything over 20K filter that tries to make itself be as brick wall and sharp as it possibly can. And it's not clean, but it's a pretty nice sounding filter. And it is very aggressive at filtering out supersonic frequencies. So you can throw that inside digital mixes if you would like. Unbox is a distortion where only the harmonics that don't alias are allowed to distort. That is very similar to focus. In fact, I think this was a precursor to focus. So this is another distortion effect, but it's a distortion effect where there's a filtration. It's probably more along the lines of focus is like a bandpass, where you distort the bandpass. Unbox, if I'm not mistaken, is a thing where it's distorting the lows, but it's not going to distort the highs. I think that's what that one is about. Again, an early version of some of this stuff. So that's another approach to resisting aliasing. And it's a pretty effective approach in its way. VaryMu is a more organic variation on pressure, which is, of course, a compressor. So VaryMu is basically pressure trying to make it be more like a real-world VaryMu compressor. Pressure has a setting called muiness that lets you crank it up and it starts acting like a VaryMu compressor. And arguably, maybe it works even better than VaryMu itself does. I think what VaryMu was about, and this is a very old plugin, it was about doing that, but cleaning it up so that it acted more like the real deal rather than the sort of extreme essence of that behavior that pressure gives you. So that's VaryMu. It's an alternative on that for a compressor. Verbity is my new best reverb, which uses feed-forward reverb topology. And we're probably going to be updating Verbity to a Verbity 2 because there's a filtration thing that it should be able to do that will make it be slightly darker. For now, Verbity is still the best sounding reverb that I've got, and there's this slight sort of high frequency vibe and sparkle and detail to it, even when it's being used fairly dark, which gives it a kind of attitude and is also slightly weird overtones on it. So the update is going to address the overtones, but we're going to leave the initial Verbity the way that it is, because for some cases, that kind of extra glitter and hallucinatory clarity of the depth of the reverb field might just be right up your alley. That's Verbity. Verbity is recent. Verbity is pretty good. Vibrato lets you vibrato, chorus, flange, and make odd FM noises. It is a vibrato in which there's an additional vibrato that frequency modulates the first vibrato. So we can do really crazy stuff with that. Vinyl Dither is a high-performance dither that converts digital noise to groove noise. It's an alternate form of dithering. It is in Ditherbox. And again, it's another way of doing that kind of stuff. It's maybe not the most high-performance dither I've got, but it's a different kind. So maybe the background noise that produces, and I think it has the DRes built into it, it's possible that the background noise built into that works for some things you might do. So if you want subtleties about something you're doing to be just a little bit different, you could look into that kind of stuff. They're not necessarily the best dithers you can get, but they are dithers. They're ways of using even the least significant bits of your digital mix creatively and towards a purpose. You figure out which thing in that is most akin to what you're trying to produce, and whether there's anything to be gained by doing something slightly unusual that way. Voice of the Starship is a deep noise tone source. It's a variety of different deep rumbles and whooshes and things like that. The idea is that it sounds like, your Star Trek Next Generation or whatever background noise. It's not literally, it's certainly not a sample of that, but it makes various kinds of rumbles and, whooshes and things, and there's filters in there that let you also have a certain amount of overtones on there as well. So you can kind of get interesting noise sources that way. And of course, the source code is available because it's all MIT licensed. So it could come in handy for like game programming and stuff. I've used it in the game counterpart that I did a while back. Voice Trick lets you record vocals while monitoring over speakers. It's the one where everything becomes mono, but one of the channels is phase flipped. So if you put a microphone in just the right place, it doesn't hear the speakers, even though your ears do still hear the speakers. So that is a handy little thing. And you probably don't need to run it as a dedicated plugin because it's contained in monitoring. And I recommend using monitoring. But it is its own standalone plugin too, if you'd like. And Wider is Airwindows stereo space shaping. It sends the signal to mid-side, and then you can do basically density on the mid or the side, and it's very good at doing high quality stereo tweaking and adjusting of like acoustic spaces, stuff like that. If you needed to do a really subtle job of taking a real recording and making it be a little bit wider or a little bit more centered, you can take the center thing and use the density algorithm to make the center come a little forward, sort of shaping the shape of the soundstage so that middle stuff is a little bit more present and forward, or farther back and distant. Wider will do all of those things. And that's it so far. I've got other stuff in the works, but it should only take me a couple of minutes to do all these things with all of those plugins, right? And people have asked me, like, what are all those plugins? Can you describe them? Well, guess what? I just described them all in alphabetical order. I'm absolutely starving and need to go have my dinner, and it's been like over an hour or something. So, never think I didn't do anything for you. On that note, I better get back to work because I have to port all of these to the new architecture. But the reason I have to port these things to the new architecture is I have one of the new Macs with the new M1 processor, and I have a really good feeling about how well that's going to work. I got a feeling that it's going to be really strong, so I'm going to be there to support it. And like they say, hey, 2 weeks. I'll have it done in 2 weeks. We'll see. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Oh, yeah, and remember, this is also including a post of some updates, which I had to do in order to do all of this work on the new porting. I had to fix the stuff that was wrong, and so a few of these little plugins, namely, let's see. So in that list, the ones that I just updated today were BuildATPDF, Iron Oxide Classic 2, PodcastDeluxe, ResEQ, Slew, and StarChild. Each of these had issues in instantiating variables where the VST and in one case also the audio unit were not instantiating properly. Maybe they made funny noises when starting up or whatever. And I fixed it because now I need to port them all. So I wanted them to be in working condition when I did. So if you're using any of those, you can download that off of this post. Or if you download new updates, they are now updated in new updates. And yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.